Brazil, but my grandparents are Japanese. That's why I'm Caucasian. So every time that I come to Whorkshop, it's like, Brazil, you sure? Yeah, the second largest Japanese community is in Brazil. So there's a lot of Japanese in Brazil, Korean and Chinese. And we're really excited. That's why, in fact, I'm managing this session, because you look at me, it's like, you're Brazilian, you look Asian, I think you could lead this learning across culture session. And I'm really happy to have Carrie, Marna, and Reynold with me today. And we're gonna have like 5 minutes talks with each one of them. And after each talk, we're gonna have 1 or 2 questions to discuss with your table. And then we're gonna have a panel with some questions. But the idea is to be, as we're doing everything here at Forge, a conversation. The idea is to discuss with each other, learn from every experience that we have. So first of all, we're gonna learn, and I loved how Carrie Lee, she did a really deep study on this subject and why she would start our talk today. Explain a little bit about what she studied, learned, and yeah, thank you so much. Carrie Lee, please welcome her.
Awesome, thank you so much, Karina. So culture has been really interesting to me living in South Africa, because it's this melting pot of cultures. And a previous brand that I used to be a part of, we dealt a lot with sort of being in the intersection of all the different cultures in South Africa. And so I ended up doing my master's thesis on going from a monocultural to a multicultural organization within the Pan-African context, because I was busy doing that. As somebody in South Africa starting a Pan-African organization and starting to work with people from across the continent. And so we thought today just to share a few things. A lot of us have heard some of the frameworks around honor, shame, culture, the different kinds of worldviews that live out there. So you have honor, shame, you have right and wrong, and sort of they're different phrases. Reynold can explain that more to you. But there's some really interesting frameworks out there that people have to help us try and understand one another, decode one another, and not misread or misinterpret one another. And so I thought just to share, many of you probably know this stuff already, but hopefully what I share you still find interesting, just to almost set the scene for us today on just the cultural differences that exist out there. So there was a lady that's actually based in the US. She wrote a book called The Culture Map, and her name is Erin Mayer. Super interesting. It's not as research robust as some of the others like Hofstede and those, but I found it a really easy to consume framework. And so I'm going to share just a little bit of that for you. So she looks at a couple of different levers. So the first is around communication. So different cultures, some cultures give low context, which means it's clear, explicit, direct, often repeat stuff to make sure that it's clarified. But other cultures will have high context, which means it's nuanced, it's layered, it's implied, not necessarily direct. You sort of read between the lines a little bit, and that is the norm in the way that the culture communicates. When it comes to feedback, you have, so all of these you can think of on a linear spectrum. Direct feedback on the one side, and indirect feedback on the other side. So honest, blunt, and public, sometimes it is direct, and indirect is diplomatic, softened, and private. Then when we talk about leadership, so I always find this interesting because we read all these Harvard Business Reviews around how to lead well, and it's often based on a certain culture group. And so you have a spectrum where some cultures are very egalitarian or very flat structured and open in dialogue, and then you have other cultures that are incredibly hierarchical. There's very clear authority lines, and there's a lot of rank and respect that happens in the different ranks. When it comes to decision making, you get consensual, so a very collective way of making decisions and group agreement, versus top down. The leader decides and it gets implemented down the ranks. Some of the other levers are the way that we build trust, and this one I found the most fascinating. And that is, Some cultures, when they do things together, they do tasks together, you build enough data points with one another to trust one another. That's how you build trust. Other cultures, the more time I spend with you and the more my relationships overlap with yours, the more I am going to trust you. So it's based on relational overlap and relational depth versus how competent I think you are. When you get to handling conflict, it's similar to, I suppose, the direct and indirect, but the one is confrontational, so you'll debate, you'll be seen as productive, and avoids conflict is disagreement, and because you don't want to harm harmony, right? So disagreements harm harmony, and so you don't want to do that, so you avoid confrontation. And so I don't know how many of you watch Ted Lasso, it might be taboo, but there's this one guy on the soccer team that is Dutch, and he always says things that are very harsh. And the rest of the team, whenever he says it, the rest of the team goes, he's not being rude, he's just being Dutch. And I think it's so funny because it just speaks to the Dutch are more confrontational, and that's just part of the reality. There was an interesting quote in Ted Lasso. How we manage time. So there's linear time, there's a start time and an end, there's a start point and an end point, and it's finite. And then there's flexible time or circular time, where it's adaptable, it's fluid, there is no actual full start and end point. It's not finite either. It kind of, it's fluid. And then the last one is persuasion. So some cultures first give principles. So you start with a theory or concept, and that's how you persuade, and others start with application and the facts and examples, and that's how you then persuade people. So you can see that these really interesting scales that exist out there. And so I thought to pull this up now that you have some of these definitions. So this is a map that shows you so they're very diplomatic, they call it South African Afrikaans. So what they're trying to say is white South African, Uganda, Botswana, Nigeria, and Zimbabwe. So you can see that from a South African perspective, a white South African has quite a gap on a lot of these levers. There's some areas where Nigeria is closer, but there's quite a gap in sort of our way that we would relate with people across the continent. And so I had to do some self-reflection on this because I needed to be able to function in team where my team was going to be looking a lot like this profile. If we just look at outside of South Africa, so the United Kingdom, United States, and again the white South African, you'll see that there's a lot leaning on the left-hand side, and so that spider web looks quite different. And so I found that super interesting because a lot of these come from a similar lineage, if you want to call it that. So from British roots, but then have morphed and changed over time. And so it's just really interesting to see that there are some similarities, but there's actually some areas that have quite a bit of distance between them. And how I personally have actually experienced some of these relationships have confused me more than my African relationships, because in South Africa I think I'm so used to the cultural complexity here, but some of the relationships with people in other continents have been more confusing to me because I'm not used to these gaps. I suppose you anticipate them being less stark. And then I put a couple more together on a map. So here's the United States, UK, and then Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. And so you can see Africa is pretty consistent on the right-hand side. Right-hand side, yeah. Whereas the West is quite consistent on being more on the left-hand side. And Nigeria springs a little bit to the left-hand side from time to time. So this is just interesting. It's interesting to know that if you come from a more Western background, you're building trust from actions. If you're coming from a more African-centric background, you're building trust through relationship. Egalitarian versus hierarchical, those are all super helpful. So me leading in a certain way is not helpful for everyone. And so how do we navigate that and have conversations around leading people whose different leadership styles have different preferred ways of being and understanding each other through that lens. So I think that gives you most of the theory. This last point is, I was talking to somebody the other day about becoming a multicultural team and how hard it is. They were saying, you know, monocultural teams, you get a lot more done. The moment diversity comes in, it gets very complicated and there's lots of friction. And I thought this was super helpful because monolithic teams are, there is minimal, what does it say down here? Degree of intergroup conflict is low. It's lovely. Things go fast. When you get to pluralistic, the people aren't, the minority group isn't so minority anymore, so they aren't necessarily assimilating. So now there's things where there's a little bit more of other cultures surfacing, and that's why there's a high conflict. But once if you push through that and you get to this multicultural one, the conflict goes down again. But so often we get to this pluralistic phase and we think it's too hard and we go back to monolithic. And so it's just an interesting model to show. And I think that's enough for now. So that's just a little bit of context for us to start off with, a little bit of a baseline, and I'm going to hand over now to Reynold. Oh no, sorry, question at your table. So with these pictures, I'm sure you were thinking about where you sit. Some of you are, what do you call it? When you grew up in a certain culture and you're living in another culture, and then your parents moved and you went to another culture. Third culture, please, thank you. So you're probably looking at that map going, I'm a bit of that and a bit of that. So have a conversation around your table around things that you have experienced where you felt some of those unexpected places that you found some of those cultural divides within the context that you have been working. I'll leave the slide up for you. So you're welcome to have chats at your table.